Bob Jackson was a simple man. All he wanted was to live a life without worries, have a wife, kids, a nice home, and a toy or two. Bob drove a Ford F-150 that his father left him when he passed away. That was 10 years ago, and the car was 15 years old at the time. Bob's dad was a carpenter and farmer, and his mom worked as a maid at the Route 66 Hotel near Bells, Tennessee. Bob grew up in Bells. In Bells, Bob lived a typical small-town life. Bells was so small that when you saw the Welcome to Bells sign, the back of the sign said, "Thank you for visiting." Bob attended elementary school, middle school, high school, and the mini market in Bells, all in the same building. Bob's nickname was BJ, and the only thing that kept Bob from being bullied was his sister Carrie. Carrie's boyfriend was a local gangster, and as a consequence, his girlfriend's brother was off limits. But as I said, Bob wanted the simple life. School was normal for Bob. He had a few friends, a girlfriend, and a bucket, cheap car, that he used to get from point A to point B, or maybe point C if he was set up. The one thing Bob did great was hunting. Bob had had a gun in his hand since he learned to walk. Okay, stumble, so what if it was a cap gun? So when an Army recruiter came to town, he talked Bob into becoming an Army Ranger. Bob's father was not happy, but realized that Bob should choose his own path in life. After graduating from high school, Bob enlisted in the Army. He was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. When the sergeant first saw Bob, he told him, "Get back on the bus and go home. Ranger school is for adults, not little boys." Bob was just over 170 centimeters tall and weighed about 1.5 pounds. But that didn't bother Bob. He was used to people underestimating him. After the first night in the field, the sergeant never underestimated Bob again. The sergeant decided to sneak up on Bob, but instead, he started looking at the barrel of Bob's M16. It was 3 in the morning, and Bob was the only one who could hear the sergeant moving through the woods. By the end of Ranger School, Bob was ranked first in his class. Bob was proud of his parents. As time went on and toward the end of his service, Bob had a chance to go to war. Bob was sent on missions that made you wonder where the hell he was. But Bob kept to himself and never told anyone anything. While at his last duty station, Bob earned an accounting degree in his spare time. That's where he met Brenda. Brenda was a very pretty woman. She was about 5'10", 103 pounds, with brown hair and hazel eyes. Brenda attracted attention wherever she went. Brenda was sexy, and she knew it. All the Eddas, Eddies, and Eddies on base and in town offered Brenda their services. But Brenda was looking for a certain type of man. Quiet, calm, and finally someone she could control. When Brenda met Bob, she realized she had found the perfect match. The only problem was that Bob knew she was out of his league and behaved accordingly. When Brenda smiled at Bob, he looked away. When Brenda approached Bob, he would walk away. Finally, one day, Bob found himself in the chapel waiting for Saturday Mass. When Brenda saw Bob, she realized she had to act quickly to get there before he saw her. Brenda sat down in the pew behind Bob, and no sooner had she touched his shoulder than Bob said, "Yes, what can I do for you?" This confused Brenda a little because she didn't realize that he was aware of her presence. As soon as Brenda smiled, Bob's heart melted, and that was the end of it. That was all it took to start their romantic relationship. From that moment on, they became a couple. When Bob brought Brenda home to introduce her to his family, they were absolutely thrilled. Brenda had an MBA, was first in her class, and she also spoke 4 languages. At Bells, the whole town wondered how Bob had gotten so lucky. Remember, Bells is a very small town, population about 225. Bob's father was happy for his son, but told him, "Be on your guard, son, when you have a woman like that. You always have to be on your guard. Be sure you treat her right and love her the way she needs to be loved. But never let her neglect you. It's okay if you don't give her everything. Sometimes you have to stand up and say no." Bob made a promise to his father that day, and he always kept his promises. Time flew by. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Bob had a nice little auditing business, and Brenda was a mid-level sales manager for a large department store. They had no children and were the perfect married couple. In Bob's opinion, everything was going perfectly. Bob was just finishing up an audit at a client's factory when he decided to stop by Brenda's office and see if she wanted to go to lunch. Bob had never been in Brenda's office before. He didn't want to disturb her work, but she had never called his office either. She would call him or leave a message at home to warn him if she was going to be late. After figuring out where Brenda's office was, he approached her secretary, whose desk was outside her office, in the hallway. "Who are you?" Brenda's secretary asked him as he stopped in front of her desk. "I'm Brenda's husband," he informed her. She laughed and told him, "Move along." Brenda's husband is 6 feet, blonde, good-looking, and works upstairs. "Would you mind bothering Mrs. Jackson right now? I'm sure we can work things out." Instead, the secretary called security. When the guards arrived on the scene, they grabbed Bob to escort him out of the building. At that moment, Brenda, unaware that her real husband was being treated like he was some kind of psycho, came out of her office holding hands with the very guy the secretary had described. Brenda was shocked, but didn't say or do anything as Bob was led away. Brenda never thought Bob would ever find out about her and her boyfriend, Don. Everyone at work was sure they were married, but now things were out of control. As soon as Bob was escorted out of the building, he immediately headed home to pack his things. Bob was crushed, but at the same time he was realistic. Bob realized that the affair with Brenda had to be long-term. If people at work thought she was married to this guy, it had to last for a while. As he was driving home, his cell phone rang. Judging by the caller ID, it was Brenda's cell phone. He didn't bother to answer it, but the phone kept ringing. Bob threw the phone out the window and continued driving. When he got home, he started packing and thinking. Bob finally realized why Brenda didn't want children, at least not his. The thought saddened him, but it didn't change anything. She had made a cuckold out of him, and he couldn't live with that. "Can you imagine that?" Brenda's secretary told her. "This bland, little worthless guy came up to me and claimed he was your husband. You! He was just delusional." They laughed at the thought of Brenda and Bob. "I don't know what to say. I don't want to brag, but honestly, in his dreams," agreed Brenda. It occurred to Brenda that she had always felt out of place with Bob. After all, Bob was a simpleton and had served his time. Brenda finished the rest of her day at work and headed home. She had no idea what to do. She had messed up, and now he knew what was going on. But she was sure Bob would listen to her and could come up with some lie that he would accept. When she pulled up to the house, Bob's car was parked in its usual spot. Brenda opened the door and called out to Bob. Nothing. It was eerily quiet. Brenda looked all around the house. Bob was gone. But Brenda didn't cry, didn't think about it. In her eyes, Bob had served his time, and now something bigger, better was waiting for her. She was even glad she didn't have to explain the reality of the situation to him. 2 weeks later, when she was having lunch with Don, her work husband, and several vice presidents of the company, a man dressed as a waiter approached her. "Are you Brenda Jackson?" the man posing as a waiter asked. "Yes," she replied, curious but not particularly worried. The man handed her a bag and said, "You've been served." Brenda blushed, grabbed the envelope, and ran to the ladies' room. Brenda was mad as hell. How could Bob do this so quickly? And what a nerve to serve her lunch in front of everyone. By the time she returned from the restroom, Don had already cleaned up. He told the vice presidents that it was an insurance claim. Brenda was glad Don was there for her. 3 months later, Brenda was sitting in her attorney's office going over the divorce papers. Bob hadn't asked her for anything, but there were some things Brenda had learned on her own. "Well," Bob's lawyer explained, "Bob sold his company." That got Brenda's attention. "What? Who did he sell his company to?" she asked. "To his sister Carrie, I believe," he replied calmly. "For how much?" she asked. "For $2. You'll get a check for your share in the mail as soon as the divorce is finalized, he informed her with a small smirk on his face. How can he do that? She asked her attorney. This company is common property and half of it belongs to me. How dare he? And where is he even located? Why isn't he here? She continued, her voice getting louder and louder. Bob's lawyer looked at Brenda and laughed, then picked up his briefcase, handed his business card to her lawyer, and walked out of the office. About that time, Bob returned home to his father's old house in Bells and listened to an offer on the property. Since his father had passed away, he and Carrie had owned the farm. There were rumors that Nissan was going to open a plant somewhere in Tennessee. The vice president in charge of Nissan's development talked to Bob about building a plant in Bells on Bob and Carrie's property. The farm was just over 200 acres, so it was exactly the size Nissan was looking for. Combined with easy access to the freeway and the fact that there was already a railroad track on one side of the land, it was the perfect location. Everyone in the town realized how advantageous it was, as Nissan's construction of a new assembly plant in Bells would attract other businesses to the area. Bob and Carrie agreed to the deal, offering a price of $35,000 to be split between them. Nissan even entered into a 6-year consulting agreement with Carrie's firm. Bob, the vice president asked after they signed the land sale agreement, what are your plans after you sell the business? Honestly, I haven't thought about what I'll be doing in the near future yet. Why do you ask? Bob, we at Nissan have done some due diligence, including looking into your background. We wanted to know if you would be interested in becoming the new head of accounting at the plant. I think I would be very interested. Of course, I'd have to learn the whole package of services Nissan offers. But I'm leaning towards saying yes. Bob agreed. Meanwhile, Brenda and Dawn received information that Nissan was building a plant in Bells. Brenda and Dawn envisioned themselves as the new power couple of Bells. But for this to happen, Brenda needed a divorce. She decided to accept Bob's settlement and hasten the divorce. She asked her attorney to get the case through the court system as quickly as he could, and 45 days later, Brenda and Bob were divorced. A week after the divorce, Brenda married Dawn in a small ceremony at a wedding chapel in Las Vegas. Bob heard about it by word of mouth, and although he frowned, he didn't say anything about it to anyone. Bob began working at the new Nissan plant, where he worked 110%. Upper management recognized talent when they saw it, and it seemed like it wasn't long before Bob was promoted to Vice President of Finance and Administration, which included Human Resources. Bob reported directly to the Executive Vice President of the region, longtime Nissan employee Henry Masagi. Henry liked Bob's no-nonsense management style. It was 2 years after the divorce, and things were going very well for Bob. He was good at his job and enjoyed it. He was very pleased with the way his relationship with his boss, Henry Masagi, was working out. They had a deep mutual respect and had become close to each other, each relying on the other's opinion. When Henry asked Bob if he could stop by his office, Bob didn't know what to expect. And he was even more surprised when Henry explained to him that Nissan had purchased the department store chain whose headquarters were located near Bells in order to keep it open and viable. Henry explained the situation and asked Bob to evaluate the new business, paying particular attention to the headquarters staff and payroll. Bob took the information back to his office where they conducted a detailed analysis. They then prepared a set of recommendations which they presented to Henry. In the end, it appeared that in order to stop the financial hemorrhaging in the business, they would have to lay off about 10% of the management staff and nearly 15% of the hourly labor force. After Henry got Bob's plan, it was time to break the bad news to management. Henry asked all the managers to come to a placemat where folding chairs had been set up. In front were a couple of large tables on either side of the podium. Brenda and Dawn hoped that they would be able to talk to Henry alone before the reorganization was announced, but Henry asked them to wait for Bob. Henry never gave Bob's last name, so when Bob Jackson, Brenda's ex, walked in, Brenda and Dawn almost crapped their pants. They were in shock. Henry couldn't help but notice the look on Brenda and Don's faces. Henry said something in Japanese to Bob, who laughed and replied in Japanese as well. Brenda had no idea that Bob knew any other languages. Bob was a simpleton, wasn't he? She was smart enough to realize that the fact that he was speaking Japanese to the executives sent to this country from Nissan, Japan was a bad sign, at least for her and Don. Henry introduced Bob to the assembled managers as head of administration, which included both human resources and accounting. Brenda sat stunned. When had this happened? When Bob became the man. Where was she when it happened? Oh yes, Don had slept with her. Brenda was so deep in thought that Don had to nudge her with his elbow to get her attention. At that moment, Bob was explaining why, if they were fired, they wouldn't get severance pay. This came as a surprise to Brenda and Don and the other middle managers because they knew that when the owners and top management sold the company to Nissan, they left with golden parachutes for themselves. But at this point, there was no money left in the business. In fact, Nissan had to make large cash infusions just to keep the doors open. So the most the laid-off managers could hope for was government unemployment compensation, which amounted to a pittance. Bob also warned the middle managers of the impending layoffs and that he and Henry had decided to cut 25% of the middle managers instead of downsizing the workforce. When Bob finished his presentation, Henry announced that HR would talk to each manager individually and then they would determine who to keep. They would be told when and where the interviews would take place, but they should take place as soon as possible. As Bob was leaving, Brenda tried to get his attention, but he just walked out talking to Henry. He didn't even look in her direction. "Oh, shit!" Don turned and said to Brenda. "Holy shit, that's for sure," she replied. "And it's a resignation at will state," she added with a concerned look on her face. "What do you mean?" asked Don. Brenda looked at Don, wondering how he could have reached his position and yet know so little about business. "It means they can fire us for any reason or no reason at all," Brenda explained. Don looked at Brenda and thought for a moment. "Brenda," he said, "you're going to have to go back to being the village respecter." Brenda looked at him like he was crazy. "And how, pray tell, am I supposed to do that?" "I don't know. You're the one who set him up. You're the one who has to make things right. Hell, sleep with him if you have to. It shouldn't be a big deal. You had fun with him for years while you were married. But understand, we have a mortgage on the house. We have bills to pay. And if one of us gets fired, we're in big financial trouble. Shit. And we won't even get the severance package we were promised. What bastards." Brenda looked at Don but said nothing. This was another instance where Brenda felt like a whore. Over the last few years of their marriage, if Don needed to get someone involved in one of his money-making schemes, Don had just foisted her on her like a piece of meat. And when Don needed sex, he just took it. He treated her like she was his property. Brenda and Don's meeting was scheduled for Saturday. They followed the directions they were given and ended up at a 25-acre ranch. As they pulled into the driveway and pulled up to the house, Brenda and Don concluded that Henry must be loaded. When they rang the bell, the door was opened by a sweet little Southern belle. "Hello, everyone," she said in the most adorable Southern accent. "My name is Pam. Please come in and make yourselves at home." Once inside, they were absolutely delighted. The house looked like one of those mansions featured on lifestyles of the rich and famous. As they walked further into the mansion, they saw co-workers walking around exploring the house. Most of them were having fun. Some of them knew it would be their last days working for the company, but it was a party. The smell of barbecue wafted through the house. Brenda and Don spotted Henry and headed straight for him. Brenda said, "Sir, your house is just wonderful." Henry laughed at her compliment. "Oh no," Henry corrected them. "It's not my house." At that moment, Bob walked over and gave them a brief glance, then turned and spoke to Henry again in Japanese. Brenda became very nervous as Bob seemed to look right through her, not even acknowledging her presence. "Bob, what did you just say?" asked Brenda, a little angry at such impoliteness on Bob's part. Henry, however, answered. He asked if I liked the house. If it's not yours, then whose house is it? Asked Brenda, because she knew that there was no way in the world this huge house belonged to Bob. Of course it's Bob's, replied Henry, a wicked grin appearing on his face as some people thought he was. Just then, Pam walked up. Bob, can you tell Jeff to go to the bodega and get another 30 bottles of wine and 5 cases of beer? Bob nodded in agreement, walked over to the intercom, and began handing out directions. Pam, you've done a wonderful job remodeling the house, Henry remarked. Thank you, Henry. You're such a sweetheart. Did you like the new pool we put in? Henry and Pam headed for the pool, Brenda and Dawn following. When they got outside, they couldn't believe their eyes. There was a lap pool, an Olympic-sized pool, and a grotto. Henry asked, Pam, if I'm not too nosy, can I ask how much the house is worth? About $4 million, Pam answered him very matter-of-factly, and the house Carrie lives in is about $1.5 million. Oh, that reminds me, how's Carrie doing? Carrie had another baby about a month ago, and she's so adorable. Every time I see Carrie's baby, I tell Bob we need to start working on getting me pregnant too. Just at that moment, Bob walked over and heard her last remark. He playfully slapped her butt. Baby, we're going to get you pregnant soon, but right now we need more to ourselves time. For the rest of the evening, Brenda walked around with a stick up her ass. She was doing well, but her fucking ex, Bob, was on top of things. Why didn't I see this coming? Bob's no fool. Oh well, now he has everything I wanted, she thought bitterly to herself. Don, on the other hand, was having a lot of fun. He flirted with all the women, but his attention was on Pam. Pam was sitting at the table eating when Don approached her. Don flirted, and Pam flirted back. But when Don touched Pam, he made the wrong choice, and Pam slapped him in the face. Don got angry and was about to slap her when Bob walked up. Don looked Bob right in the eye and said to him, "Why don't you leave before you get your little ass spanked?" And I don't know if you've heard the Jim Krause song Bad Bad Leroy Brown, but as it says, Leroy was like a puzzle with a couple lost pieces. Don got his ass kicked by sleeping with a jealous man's wife. Needless to say, Don didn't have the best night. When the job cuts were announced, Brenda and Don's names surprisingly didn't make the list. But they did have to take a slight pay cut. A year later, Pam finally got what she wanted. Twin girls, and a couple years after that, a little boy who looked just like Bob. A year after that, Don and Brenda divorced. One night, Don came home with some guys from work. They hooked up with Brenda. Brenda overheard Don telling the guys, "She was a slut when I met her, so why stop now?" When Don woke up, Brenda was gone. Brenda had left Don a note. All it said was, "Did I leave it for you?" Don didn't care that Brenda was gone because to him, she had never been anything but a whore and a slut anyway. A month later, Don was found dead in the bathtub, both wrists cut to the bone. Next to him lay test results showing he was HIV positive. Brenda began working at one of the company's West Coast stores. She went to Bob's house to apologize before leaving. But when Brenda saw Bob playing in the yard with his beautiful young wife and children, she just got in her car and drove away. Brenda cried for many more days. Many years later, Brenda read an article while lying in a hospital bed. She didn't have HIV, but she had cancer. She was taking chemotherapy, but it wasn't working. It was an article about CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and it talked about Bob, Pam, their 5 children and 15 grandchildren. The closest Brenda came to finding another man like Bob was a beagle she named after him. And that's the closest I can come to forgiving the lying whore. After all, she kept her job.